Welcome to the Middleware Tech YouTube channel. In this series, you'll learn about Spring Container Scope. All code examples used in the videos will be available on GitHub. Let's get started.
Okay, Spring container support two type of scope. Spring container support two type of scope. One type of a scope that is called singleton. Another type of a scope that is called prototype. One type of a scope that is called singleton. Another type of a scope that is called prototype. So what does it mean by these two type of a scope? What are the difference between these two type of a scope? Let's explore into this mode, right? Let's talk about this two type of a scope supported by Spring Container. Now see, now if you see this example that we have done just now I'm talking about a scope. So let's talk about first singleton scope. Let's talk about singleton scope. Okay, let's talk about singleton scope. So what does it mean by singleton scope? Singleton scope means if you send multiple requests to the container will create only one object of the class. Okay, singleton scope means that container will create only one instance. When client request will come, so container will create only one instance. So you can say like when client request come, then container create only one instance of the class. So if it is, let me check how the application context container is going to work. Now see here, what I'm going to do, if you see this application context container, let me do it for this first. Or you can try for bin factory container first as you wish. So let me do it for the bin factory container. So for bin factory container, you are sending request, right? What I'm going to do is that I'm going to send multiple requests. See here. Now, how to understand in which scope it is? If you go to your spring.xml file, okay, there is an attribute called scope. Scope equal to, and you can provide the scope here as singleton. You can provide the scope. So now the question is that if I'm not going to provide this attribute, scope singleton, then by default it is counted as a singleton. Okay, by default, if you are not providing that scope value, by default IOC container count it as a singleton scope. Now if you put this bin in a singleton scope, and go to client.java file, if you see here, I'm sending a request 3 times. Let me check how many objects it is creating. right click, run as Java application. If you send the request 3 times, you can see here, if you send a request 3 times, you can see here only one object is created. So how many times client is going to send a request? It is going to get only one object. Each and every time it's going to get only one object, right? So that is called singleton scope. How many times you are going to send a request? When client request come, then client get only one instance. You can send request 100 times, so it is going to get only one instance, and that instance is being returned to the client, right? Okay, now now we are talking about that in case of I'm talking about singleton scope, right? Singleton scope, how it work in case of bin factory container. Okay, I'm talking about singleton scope. My container is bin factory. Okay, and my container is application context. Application context. Fine, container. Now, next we have another one time. One is called object created. Loading time. Another time is request time. So when object created, right? So assume this is the corresponding diagram. Now I want to see in case of singleton scope. In case of singleton scope, how these two containers actually behave. In case of singleton scope, for bin factory container, when the object is created. So let me disable. Now we're talking about, we are using bin factory container, right? So, and singleton scope, bin factory container and singleton scope. We just save all, right click, run as Java application. So when you execute, what you find is that at the time of loading, you will not get any object. So object created when client request will come. In case of singleton scope. So right click, run as Java application. Yes, correct. So you can change like loading time, no. Object creation, request time, object created, yes. Fine, for bin factory container. So let me check for singleton scope how application context container will work. Right? For singleton scope, how application context container will work. Fine. So let's come to the application context container. Now this is an application context container. As I told you that if I'm not going to write any scope, by default it is a singleton only. Now if you go into client, so let me check, let me disable this. Right click, run as Java application. You can see at the time of loading only it is going to create the object. Now how many times you are going to how many times the client request come, it does not matter. Control V, assume in this example 3 times client request comes in this example. Save it, right click, run as Java application. Now you can see here 3 times client request came, but the object created only 1 time. 3 times client request came, but the constructor is called only 1 time. Correct? If this is the scenario, here in that case we can write like for application context container, loading time For application context container, loading time the object created, not the request time. So this is the difference. How in case of singleton scope, how both the container work. Correct, and the default scope. So it is a default scope in the spring.xml file. So you can write here default scope, right? Fine. Next, I told you that we have another one container, another one scope is there, that is called prototype scope. Prototype scope. So how prototype scope will work? So prototype scope means that it will create multiple instance. Prototype scope means it will create multiple instance when client request will come multiple time. So you can write here. That first of all, it is not a default scope. It is not a default scope, right? And the second point is that when client request come, then container will create multiple object. When multiple request, when multiple client request come, then container create multiple instance. When multiple requests come, when multiple client request come, then container multiple instance in case of prototype. So let me check how this prototype scope will work, and let me just write this diagram once again, and this time we'll talk about this diagram for prototype scope. Okay, this diagram we'll talk about for prototype scope. So let me see how it work and remove both. Fine. So what I have to do, let's start with first bin factory container. Okay. Let's start with bin factory container. This is my bin factory container. So in case of bin factory container, open this spring.xml and change this scope to prototype. Right. So I made the scope as a prototype. Now just see in the client. Let me disable this. And let me disable this. Now if you see here, when the client request come, let me check. At the time of loading, it is going to create the object or not in case of prototype scope. So right click, run as Java application. So if you see at the time of loading, it is not going to create the object. In case of prototype scope, then at the time of request comes, save it, right click, run as Java application. So when the request comes, as a prototype, okay, some small mistake, prototype, save it. Okay, so once again I have to do. So at the time of loading, object created or not, let me check. So if you see at the time of loading, object is not created. At the time of loading, the object is not created. So object should create So at the time of loading, if the object is not created, so you can see here no. So let me make the request time. Now this is a prototype scope, right? So at the time of request, object should be created. Right click, run as Java application. Yes, at the time of request, object created. Now now you can see this time it's creating a multiple object. If you see this time, it is created a multiple object, right? So it's created a multiple object, right? So this multiple object created because the scope is prototype. This multiple object is created because the scope is prototype, right? Okay. So what you can do here is like, now you can see request time object is created. Yes. So it is same like bin factory container is behaving same like in singleton scope as well as in port type scope. It is behaving same. Correct. Now let me check that how application context container is behaving in case of port type scope. Let me check. So let's go to application context container. Let's go to application context container and change the scope to prototype. It's a default scope, right? Singleton is a default scope. So change the scope to prototype. Prototype. Change the scope to prototype. Now, when the scope is prototype, save it and right click, clear. Right now go to client. Let me just loading time. Let me check first loading time. Save it. Now we are talking about application context container in prototype scope, right? So right click, run as Java application. Okay, just see here, please. In case of prototype scope, application context container is not creating object at the time of loading. In case of prototype scope, application container is not creating object at the time of loading. See here, last time it was creating an object at the time of loading. In case of singleton scope. In case of prototype scope, application container is not creating object at the time of loading. So when the object is created, let me check. Now do one thing, now make it a request time. Just change it as a request time. Save it. Right click, run as Java application. Right click, run as Java application. Now you can see here, object created when client request come. Object created when client request come. Correct? So you can change the same scenario here. So application context container create an object in case of prototype scope when client request come. So this is how we can differentiate between application bin factory containers and application context container, right? Under singleton scope as well as under prototype scope. Fine guys, anything else you want to add?